January 1st, 1863. As dawn breaks over Galveston Harbor, the air is thick with smoke and the cries of battle. Amidst the chaos, a father rushes aboard a captured Union ship, only to find his son mortally wounded. This is the Battle of Galveston, a tale of strategy, sacrifice, and the complexities of a nation divided. Galveston, Texas, a vital port city on the Gulf of Mexico. Its deepwater harbor made it a strategic asset during the Civil War. Control of Galveston meant dominance over crucial supply lines and trade routes. Following his successful campaigns in New Orleans and Vicksburg, Rear Admiral David Glasgow Farragut turned his attention to the Texas coast. Recognizing Galveston's strategic importance and its vulnerable defenses, he dispatched Commander William Bainbridge Renshaw to seize the port city. A seasoned naval officer since 1831, Renshaw assembled a formidable squadron for the mission. His fleet included the sidewheel steamer Harriet Lane, the gunboats Owasco, Clifton, Sachem, and Westfield, the tender John F. Carr, transports Cavello and Elias Pike, and the pilot schooner LeCompte. The Harriet Lane, constructed for the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, was named after President James Buchanan's niece. Armed with a mix of shell guns and howitzers, she was a formidable presence in the Gulf. On October 4, 1862, Renshaw's fleet entered Galveston Harbor. Facing minimal resistance, Confederate forces under General Paul Hebert deemed defense futile and withdrew. By October 9th, Union forces occupied the city. Despite the occupation, Renshaw expressed concerns about maintaining control without ground troops. Farragut assured him that reinforcements would arrive and emphasized that the Navy must hold Galveston at all costs. It wasn't until December 24th that elements of the 42nd Massachusetts Infantry, led by Colonel Isaac S. Burrell, arrived and occupied Coons Wharf. By day, Union soldiers patrolled the city. By night, they retreated to the relative safety of Coons Wharf. The incomplete fortifications and the ever-present threat of Confederate attack kept tensions high. As Union forces established a precarious foothold on Galveston Island, a new Confederate commander arrived on the Texas coast with bold intentions. Major General John Bankhead Magruder, a flamboyant West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran, had recently assumed command of the District of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Known for his theatrical flair and aggressive tactics, Magruder was appalled that Texas's largest port had fallen without a fight. Within days of taking command in late November 1862, he resolved to reverse the Union occupation with a daring and unconventional plan. Magruder immediately began organizing a two-pronged assault to reclaim Galveston. One force would strike by land, the other by sea. For the naval operation, he turned to a man uniquely suited to the task, Leon Smith. Smith was a seasoned steamboat captain, well known along the rivers and coasts of the Gulf. He and Magruder had crossed paths years earlier in California after the Mexican War. Now, their friendship and shared sense of daring would prove decisive. Without formal naval rank, Smith was nevertheless entrusted with extraordinary responsibility. Magruder commissioned him as a commodore in the ad hoc Confederate Navy of Texas and tasked him with converting two commercial steamers, the Bayou City and Neptune, into instruments of war. Lacking iron plating, Smith relied on what Texas had in abundance: cotton. He lined the decks with compressed bales, creating floating fortresses that offered some protection from small arms fire, if not direct hits from Union artillery. These cottonclads, as they came to be known, were crude but courageous solutions. To give them teeth, Armand Weir of the 1st Texas Heavy Artillery mounted a rifled gun aboard the Bayou City and 2 howitzers on the Neptune. As the crews drilled and prepared for the assault, Smith turned riverboats into raiders, makeshift warships that would soon face some of the most powerful vessels in the Union Navy. On board, he placed dismounted cavalry from the 5th and 7th Texas. Volunteers turned horse marines for the mission. The 5th, commanded by Colonel Thomas Greene, had been key to the Confederate victory at Valverde in the spring, but was forced to retreat back to Texas when their supply train was destroyed by Union forces at Glorieta Pass. Greene gathered his troops.
Tom Greene lined up his regiment at Harrisburg, and he delivered one of the only speeches his men ever recalled him delivering. He said, "Men, I've never deceived you. I will not deceive you now. I regard this as the most dangerous enterprise that men have ever engaged in. I don't want any man to volunteer who's not prepared to die and die now." And every single man in that regiment stepped forward and volunteered for this incredibly dangerous expedition.
By New Year's Eve, Confederate infantry, cavalry, and artillery had gathered across the bay from Galveston. Their orders: launch a surprise attack at dawn, coordinated with a naval assault by the cottonclads. For Magruder, this was more than a military operation. It was a symbolic reclamation of Texas soil and Confederate honor. As dawn broke on New Year's Day, the Confederate offensive commenced. The Neptune and Bayou City advanced toward the Union fleet, while ground troops under the command of William Dirty Neck Scurry engaged Union positions on Coons Wharf. The Bayou City began to fire its 32-pounder rifled gun at the Union ships, but after only 4 shots, it exploded, killing Captain Weir and wounding several others. The Neptune attempted to ram the Harriet Lane, but sustained critical damage and began to sink. Despite this, her crew continued to fire upon the Union vessel, drawing its attention. Seizing the opportunity, the Bayou City struck the Harriet Lane, embedding itself into the Union ship. Confederate forces boarded, leading to intense close-quarters combat. Federal resistance ended when the Lane's captain Jonathan Wainwright, already wounded twice, was shot through the head by Leon Smith. The executive officer, Lieutenant Edward Lea, was mortally wounded, so the rest of the Harriet Lane's officers and crew surrendered. Among the many tragic stories of the Battle of Galveston, none speaks more deeply to the heartbreak of Civil War than that of Edward Lea. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy class of 1855, Edward had risen to the rank of lieutenant commander in the Union Navy. His father, Albert Miller Lea, had graduated from the U.S. Military Academy years earlier. An accomplished engineer and classmate of John Bankhead Magruder, Albert chose to cast his lot with the Confederacy when the war broke out. Edward remained loyal to the Union. The war divided them not just by allegiance, but by silence. Father and son never spoke again. By late 1862, Albert Lea was serving as a major on Magruder's staff. On the morning of January 1, 1863, as the battle raged across Galveston's harbor, Albert watched from a rooftop at Ashton Villa, unaware that his son was aboard the Harriet Lane, serving as its executive officer. Only after the guns fell silent did Albert reveal to Magruder that his son had been in the harbor, on the other side. Magruder, stunned, gave his old friend immediate permission to board the captured vessel in search of his son. Albert climbed aboard the blood-stained deck of the Harriet Lane, where he found Edward, mortally wounded and barely conscious. The long estrangement ended in a quiet, agonizing reunion. Albert held his son's hand and promised to return with help. But by the time he secured a litter and ambulance, it was too late. When the ship's surgeon asked Edward if he had any final words, he simply replied, "No, my father is here." In the aftermath of the battle, Magruder authorized Albert to organize a military funeral. Union and Confederate officers stood side by side as Edward Lea and his shipmate, Commander Jonathan Wainwright, were buried with full honors in Galveston. Even in victory, Magruder recognized that honor and heartbreak knew no uniform. During the chaos, the Union flagship, USS Westfield, ran aground. Commander Renshaw, unwilling to let the ship fall into Confederate hands, ordered it destroyed. However, the explosives detonated prematurely, killing Renshaw and several crew members. With their flagship destroyed and leadership lost, the remaining Union vessels withdrew from Galveston Harbor, leaving the 42nd Massachusetts Infantry isolated on Coons Wharf. Surrounded and outnumbered, Colonel Burrell and his men were compelled to surrender. They were later paroled and returned to Union lines. The Confederate victory at Galveston was a significant morale boost and demonstrated the effectiveness of unconventional warfare. The battle remains a poignant example of the personal tragedies wrought by Civil War, epitomized by the story of the Lees, a father and son on opposing sides, united in the final moments of life.
At the end of the war, Galveston was the last major Confederate port anywhere. Not only was it the last major port, but it held out longer than anybody would reasonably have expected from an island city. It would last until June of 1865, over a month and a half after Robert E. Lee's famous surrender in Virginia. And Galveston would have the significance of being the only major port that the Confederates ever recaptured once it had been captured by the Union.
Hi, this is Johnny Anderson, producer at Civil War Studios. First, I want to offer my thanks to Ed Cotham for not only appearing in this episode, but also the great research that we took advantage of from his book, Battle on the Bay, which is available on Amazon. We also used another great book on the Battle of Galveston as source material, Cottonclads by Dr. Donald Frazier of the Texas Center, which is also available on Amazon, is another great read. Today, if you visit Galveston, you won't see much evidence of one of the pivotal battles in Texas during the war between the states ever took place here. Coons Wharf has been commercialized, and the dock where the Harriet Lane was brought back to is a cruise terminal. There are two great locations where you can experience the Battle of Galveston. The first is the Alvin Museum in Alvin, Texas, where the salvaged artifacts of the USS Westfield are on display. And the other is the Trinity Episcopal Cemetery located on Broadway in Galveston, where not only Edward Lea and Jonathan Wainwright are buried, but also cenotaphs to the soldiers on both the Union and Confederate sides who lost their lives during the battle, plus the graves of Armand Weir, who was killed when the gun that was mounted on the Bayou City exploded, and the General, John Bankhead Magruder. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure and give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time on Lone Star Warriors as we continue to explore the battles that shaped Texas and the nation.